It was a biting, cold morning when the paths of two people crossed for the first time. A barefoot girl extended a trembling hand, seeking compassion, while a cold-hearted millionaire prepared to utter words that would echo through the years. What began as a public humiliation would transform into the most astonishing turnaround that city had ever witnessed. Prepare to discover how the strength of the human spirit can rewrite any story of defeat. Subscribe to the channel for stories that touch the heart every day. The aroma of gourmet coffee and freshly baked croissants wafted through the glass doors of the most exclusive restaurant in town, the Gilded Spoon. It was one of those establishments where the price of a single meal equaled a working family's monthly rent. Polished mahogany tables reflected the golden light of crystal chandeliers as tuxedoed waiters circulated among patrons dressed in outfits that cost fortunes. Outside, the contrast was stark. The Italian marble sidewalk, which should have symbolized elegance, served as a stage for a very different reality. There, huddled against the piercing morning wind, a girl no more than 10 years old extended her small, trembling hand to each person who passed. Her once shiny brown hair now hung tangled over her thin shoulders. Her threadbare clothes, patched in several places, barely protected her from the cold that turned her lips purple. But it was her eyes that drew the most attention. Large, dark, and full of a hope that defied all the misery around her. "Please," she murmured with a voice hoarse from spending the night sleeping in the open, "just a little food." Passers-by hurried past, some averting their gaze with discomfort, others pretending not to see her. It was as if she were invisible, a ghost haunting the entrance to the privileged paradise. It was then that the deep rumble of a powerful engine cut through the morning air. A black Bentley, impeccably polished, glided to a stop in front of the restaurant with the smoothness of a shadow. The driver, dressed in a grey livery, quickly jumped out to open the rear door. From it emerged a man who looked like he had stepped out of the pages of a business magazine. Tall, broad-shouldered, he wore an Italian suit that cost more than many people earned in a year. His handmade leather shoes reflected the morning light, and the Swiss watch on his wrist was worth more than a house. But it was his face that revealed his true nature. Aristocratic features hardened by years of power, eyes as cold as ice, and a smile that never truly touched his lips. The millionaire walked toward the entrance of the restaurant with the confidence of someone who owned the world. Each step echoed authority, each movement radiated the kind of arrogance that only money and power can produce. He wasn't just rich. He was the kind of man who believed his fortune made him superior to all other human beings. The girl, seeing him approach, felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this well-dressed man, who clearly possessed abundant resources, could be touched by her situation. With her heart pounding, she rose from the cold ground and approached him timidly. "Sir," she said in a voice barely a whisper, "could you help me? I haven't eaten anything since yesterday." The millionaire stopped. For a moment, his eyes fixed on the frail figure before him. But instead of compassion, what arose on his face was pure disdain. His lips curled into a cruel smile, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of privilege and arrogance. "You're making this place look bad," he said, raising his voice intentionally so that everyone could hear. "Beggars like you are a plague on this city." The words fell on the girl like lashes. Around them, passers-by stopped to watch the scene, some discreetly taking out their cell phones to record. Restaurant employees appeared at the door, and even some customers turned in their seats to watch the spectacle. "Someone like you," the man continued, his voice now echoing down the street, "will never be worth anything. You were born to be nothing, and you will be nothing forever." The girl recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Tears welled up in her eyes, streaming down her dirty cheeks. Unable to utter a word, she turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold asphalt as the cruel laughter of some onlookers echoed behind her. The millionaire, pleased with his performance, adjusted his tie and entered the restaurant as if nothing had happened. For him, it had been just another moment of confirmed superiority, more proof that the world was divided between those who mattered and those who were nothing more than human trash. He didn't know that that moment, those cruel words, would become the catalyst for a transformation that would change not only the girl's life, but also his own. He couldn't imagine that he had just planted the seeds of his own downfall, and that years later, that same child he had humiliated would return to, completely rewrite his story. The girl ran through the streets until her legs could no longer support her. She stopped in a dark alley, away from prying eyes and cruel laughter, and collapsed against a damp wall. Tears came in waves, each sob echoing the pain of the words she had heard. "You were born to be nothing," she repeated in her mind, the millionaire's words hammering in her heart like nails being driven in. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, as if she could disappear completely from the world that seemed so hostile. Meanwhile, in the elegant restaurant, the millionaire savored his breakfast without a shred of remorse. Sitting at the main table, he leafed through the financial newspaper while enjoying eggs Benedict prepared by a renowned chef. Around him, other businessmen and socialites commented discreetly on the scene they had witnessed. "That was a bit harsh, don't you think?" murmured an elderly lady, stirring her cup uncomfortably. The man didn't even look up from the newspaper. "The city needs order," he replied coldly. "If we start feeding every beggar that comes along, we'll soon have a city infested with them." His words were met with an uncomfortable silence, but he didn't care. For him, he had only demonstrated leadership, established clear boundaries between social classes. That's how the world worked, and he prided himself on maintaining that natural order. 3 blocks away, in the alley where the girl was crying, soft footsteps approached. A middle-aged woman, wearing simple but clean clothes, stopped before the huddled child, her gentle eyes filled with compassion at the sight of the deplorable state in which she found herself. "Honey," she said softly, kneeling beside the girl. "What happened?" The child lifted her tear-streaked face. For a moment she hesitated, too accustomed to rejection to trust immediately. But there was something about the woman's presence that radiated safety and warmth. A rich man said I'll never be anything," she managed to say between sobs. "Said I'm a plague." The woman felt her heart clench. She worked for a non-profit organization that rescued children living on the streets, and she had seen a lot of suffering. But there was something about this girl, an inner strength that shone through the pain, that touched her deeply. "Listen carefully," she said, taking the girl's small, cold hands in her own. "That man is wrong, completely wrong. You are not defined by what others say about you. You are defined by what you choose to do with your life." The words fell on the girl like balm on an open wound. For the first time in years, someone was talking to her as if she were a human being worthy of respect and consideration. "My name is Mrs. Davison," the woman continued, "and I'm going to take you to a place where you'll be cared for, where you can study and discover what you're capable of." As Mrs. Davison led the girl away from that alley, helping her take her first steps toward a new life, the millionaire finished his lavish breakfast. He paid the bill without looking at the amount, a sum that could feed a family for months, left a generous tip that was more a gesture of ostentation than of generosity, and left the restaurant. His driver waited patiently beside the Bentley. As the car glided through the city streets toward his office, the man contemplated the ordinary people walking on the sidewalks through the window. To him, they were all insignificant figures, pieces of a scenery that existed only to highlight his own greatness. He didn't know that, at that very moment, the girl he had humiliated was being enrolled in a social assistance program that would completely change her trajectory. He couldn't imagine that the seeds of determination, watered by tears of humiliation, were already beginning to germinate in the heart of that child. The millionaire arrived at his office on the top floor of a skyscraper, where his secretary awaited him with the day's agenda. Important meetings, decisions that would affect thousands of jobs, investments that would yield millions. It was his world, his kingdom, and he reigned supreme. But somewhere in the city, a 10-year-old girl was discovering that she possessed something that all the money in the world couldn't buy, an unwavering will to prove that cruel man was completely wrong about her. And so began a journey that would take years to complete, but that had already been initiated with the tears shed that cold morning. Fate sometimes works in mysterious ways, transforming moments of greatest pain into catalysts for the greatest victories. 7 years had passed since that fateful morning. The millionaire, now with graying hair at his temples, maintained his position as one of the most powerful men in the city. His business empire had expanded, encompassing everything, from construction companies to luxury hotel chains. Each conquest fueled his already inflated ego even further. Each success confirmed his belief that he was above common mortals. His mansion, a modern 3-story palace located in the most exclusive neighborhood in town, Bel Air, was a temple dedicated to his own success. Infinity pool, gardens designed by renowned landscapers, a garage with a collection of cars worth more than many companies. Each room was decorated with expensive works of art. Each detail screamed opulence. But behind all that grandeur, cracks were beginning to appear. The market was changing. New players were emerging with innovative proposals, and some of his main companies were facing difficulties. Nothing alarming yet, but enough to bother a man accustomed only to victories. On that particular morning, he found himself in his private office, an imposing room with panoramic views of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perspective that made any visitor feel small in the face of such greatness. His rosewood desk, larger than many people's beds, was covered in reports that didn't bring the news he expected to hear. Quarterly sales were below expectations, informed his CFO, a nervous man who was sweating even in the air conditioning. The new construction company that emerged on the market is offering very competitive prices and... Impossible, the millionaire interrupted, his voice laden with disdain. A newcomer company can't possibly compete with us. We have decades of experience, established relationships, capital they don't even dream of having. But deep down in his mind, a small seed of worry began to germinate. In recent months, he had heard whispers about a new businesswoman who was revolutionizing the market. Someone young, visionary, who managed to win contracts that were historically his. What irritated him most was not being able to get concrete information about this competitor. Her name circulated in business circles like an urban legend. Everyone talked about her, but few had seen her in person. It was as if she were a ghost haunting his business. "Find out everything about this businesswoman," he ordered his personal assistant. "I want to know where she came from, how she got capital, what her weaknesses are. Nobody builds an empire from nothing." The assistant nodded nervously and left the room. The millionaire was left alone with his thoughts, looking out the window. At the city, he considered his personal property. Down there, human ants moved through the streets, all irrelevant, all inferior. His mind returned briefly to that morning 7 years ago when he had humiliated a beggar girl in front of a restaurant. It was a vague memory, overshadowed by hundreds of other moments in which he had demonstrated his superiority over the less fortunate. For him, it had been just another normal day, another confirmation of the natural order of things. He couldn't imagine that that girl, at that very moment, was in a meeting room in another building in the city, finalizing the acquisition of yet another company that had belonged to one of his former business partners. He didn't know that she had become exactly the kind of competitor he feared most: smart, determined, and completely committed to a goal he didn't yet understand. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was his stockbroker, with news that made his stomach clench. "The stock of your main construction company plummeted 15% today," the strained voice on the other end of the line reported. "It seems your biggest corporate client cancelled the contract and signed with the new company. Wall Street is speculating about a possible crisis in your business group." The millionaire hung up the phone harder than necessary. For the first time in decades, he felt something he couldn't quite identify. Was it fear? Uncertainty? The sensation was strange, uncomfortable, like a suit that no longer fit. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city bustle below. For all those years, he had felt like a god observing insignificant mortals. But now, for the first time, he began to question whether his position at the top was as secure as he had always believed. What he didn't know was that his downfall had begun long ago, initiated by the tears of a girl he had scorned, and that the force responsible for his ruin was closer than he could ever imagine. While the millionaire faced the first cracks in his empire, across town, in a modern and stylish building, an extraordinary meeting was taking place. The conference room, overlooking the financial district, housed some of the most influential business people in the region. They had all come to meet in person the woman who was revolutionizing the market. She entered the room with a presence that commanded instant respect. It wasn't just her erect posture or the impeccably tailored suit she wore. It was something deeper, a confidence that emanated from within, built on solid foundations of knowledge and determination. Her eyes, once filled with the tears of a humiliated child, now shone with the assurance of someone who had transformed pain into power. "Gentlemen," she began in a firm, clear voice, "thank you for accepting my invitation. I know many of you are curious about who I am and where I come from." The men around the table, all older, all accustomed to dominating meetings like this one, leaned forward, genuinely interested. They rarely encountered someone capable of commanding a room with such naturalness. "My story is not conventional," she continued, walking slowly around the table as she spoke. "I didn't inherit fortunes. I didn't have silver spoons. What I had was something much more valuable, a lesson about the true value of people." She stopped before the window, looking at the city that stretched out below. Her mind returned briefly to that frightened girl who had run through the streets crying. But now that memory didn't bring pain, it brought strength. "7 years ago," she said, turning to face the group, "I learned that there is a fundamental difference between having power and being powerful, between possessing wealth and possessing worth, and it was that lesson that built everything you see today." At that same hour, 40 stories away, the millionaire received a report that made his blood run cold. His secretary had managed to get some information about the mysterious businesswoman, and what she discovered was disturbing. "She appeared on the business scene only 3 years ago," the report read, "but her growth is unprecedented. She started with a tech startup focused on social solutions, expanded into civil construction with affordable housing projects, and is now diversifying into the luxury market. Most impressive is her ability to win over clients who were historically loyal to established companies. What intrigued him most were her methods. It wasn't just a matter of competitive prices. She offered something he had never considered important. She treated each client as if they were unique, each project as if it were personal. Her employees spoke of her with a devotion he had never inspired in his own employees. "There's something else," the secretary continued, hesitant. "She has a social program parallel to the business. rescues street children, offers scholarships, funds training programs. It's as if the social aspect is as important as profit. The millionaire laughed with disdain. Typical of amateurs. Mixing sentimentality with business is the perfect recipe for bankruptcy. She won't last long in the market. But his words sounded hollow, even to himself. The numbers didn't lie. She was gaining ground, winning market share, and he was losing position. For the first time in his career, he felt threatened by someone he didn't even know. Back in the meeting room, the businesswoman finalized her presentation with a proposal that left everyone present impressed. It wasn't just a business plan, it was a vision of how to transform profit into positive social impact, how to build companies that grew along with the communities they served. "The question I ask you," she said, placing her hands on the table and looking each man in the eyes, "is simple. Do you want to continue doing business the old way, or are you ready to discover what happens when we treat people like people, not like numbers?" The silence that followed was filled with reflection. Some of the business people present had built their fortunes exactly in the old way, she mentioned, treating employees as costs to be minimized, clients as sources of revenue to be exploited, communities as obstacles to be overcome. But there was something in her presence, in the way she talked about business with genuine passion, that made them question whether there might not be a better way to do things. A way that not only generated more profit, but also left a legacy of real value. When the meeting ended, 3 of the 5 business people present signed partnership agreements immediately. It was more than she expected, but less than she knew was possible. The real test was yet to come. The confrontation with the man who had planted the seed of her determination without even knowing it. As she watched the city from her office window, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of revenge, but of quiet satisfaction. The girl who had been humiliated had grown up, studied, fought, and won. Now it was time to teach a lesson about true power and about the consequences of underestimating human potential. The following months brought an avalanche of bad news for the millionaire. Contracts were cancelled weekly. Old clients politely excused themselves while signing with the mysterious competitor, and his investors began to ask uncomfortable questions. What had started as small cracks in his empire was now turning into deep fissures that threatened its entire structure. Sitting in his private office, surrounded by stacks of discouraging financial reports, he tried to understand how he had reached this point. His main construction company had lost 60% of its contracts in the last quarter. 2 of his subsidiary companies had posted losses for the first time in decades, and his stock value was plummeting daily. The phone rang, interrupting his gloomy reflections. It was his chief accountant, his voice strained with devastating news. "We need to talk urgently," the man said on the other end of the line. "The situation is more serious than we thought. If the trend continues, we'll have to consider drastic measures." Drastic measures. The words echoed in the millionaire's mind like an ominous omen. In his entire career, he had never faced anything like this. He had always been the one who imposed the conditions, who made the rules, who decided the fate of other, less fortunate business people. Meanwhile, in another part of town, the businesswoman walked through the hallways of a support center for children at risk. It was one of her regular visits, moments she considered as important as any business meeting. The children greeted her with genuine smiles, knowing that she wasn't there just to pose for pictures or promote herself. She was there because she truly cared. "How are little Michael's studies going?" she asked one of the caregivers, referring to an 8-year-old boy who had arrived at the center a few months ago. "He's doing very well," the woman replied proudly. "Yesterday he told me that he wants to be an engineer when he grows up. He said he wants to build beautiful houses for people who have nowhere to live." The phrase touched the businesswoman's heart. That was exactly how she herself had felt years ago, a child with dreams too big for her small reality. But someone had believed in her, someone had invested in her potential when everyone else saw only a worthless beggar. "And you know what I always say," she continued, addressing all the children who had gathered around her. "It doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is where you choose to go." One of the girls, about 10 years old, raised her hand timidly. "But what if people say we're nothing? What if they say we'll never make it?" The question hit the businesswoman like a punch to the gut. For a moment, she saw herself again in that dark alley, crying after being humiliated by a man who considered his superiority a natural right. But now, looking at those hopeful faces, she knew exactly what to answer. "Then you prove them wrong," she said firmly. "You study, you work, you dream, and you never ever give up. And one day, when you meet those people again, you'll show them what it really means to have worth." That night, in her elegant but cozy penthouse apartment, she worked late reviewing plans for the next step in her strategy. It wasn't just a matter of business, it was a matter of justice. For years, she had built her empire not only to prove her own worth, but to be in a position to teach an important lesson about human dignity. The benefit gala she was organizing would be the culmination of everything. A night seemingly dedicated to charity, but which would actually be the stage for a reunion that would change two lives forever. She had carefully studied the millionaire's financial situation, knew exactly when he would be most vulnerable, most desperate for an opportunity to recover his position, and she had prepared a surprise he could never imagine. At the millionaire's mansion, the silence of the early morning was broken only by the sound of nervous footsteps in the office. He paced back and forth, trying to find a solution to his growing crisis. His options dwindled with each passing day, and for the first time in his adult life, he began to consider the real possibility of losing everything. The gold-embossed invitation on his desk seemed to glow in the moonlight that came through the window. A high-end benefit gala with the presence of the city's business elite. Normally, he wouldn't consider attending. Charity had always seemed like a waste of time and money. But now, desperate for networking and opportunities for recovery, he knew he couldn't afford to dismiss any chance. He didn't know he had just decided to attend his own judgment, where a girl he had scorned would finally have the opportunity to show the true meaning of power and dignity. The night of the benefit gala arrived with pomp and circumstance. The main ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel had been transformed into a dazzling setting, with crystal chandeliers projecting golden light onto tables decorated with floral arrangements that cost more than many families' monthly rent. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, circulated among glasses of champagne and gourmet canapes, all eager to meet the event's mysterious organizer. The millionaire arrived punctually, but he was no longer the same arrogant man of months ago. His posture remained erect, his suit was still impeccable, but there was something different in his eyes, a shadow of insecurity that he struggled to hide. The financial pressures had taken their toll, and he knew that this night could be crucial for his business survival. He greeted acquaintances with the forced smile of someone who needed to keep up appearances, accepted veiled condolences about his financial situation with feigned dignity, and discreetly observed the other guests, trying to identify potential investors or partners who could save him from imminent ruin. It was then that the lights dimmed and an expectant silence filled the room. A female figure emerged on the central stage, and the impact was immediate. She wore an elegant black dress that highlighted her confident posture, hair perfectly styled, framing a face that radiated serene determination. There was something about her presence that commanded absolute attention. It wasn't just beauty or elegance, but an inner strength that manifested in every movement. "Good evening," she began, her clear voice echoing through the room through the sound system. "Thank you for being here to support a cause that is very special to me, the rescue and empowerment of children at risk." The millionaire felt something strange when he heard her voice. There was a disturbing familiarity, like a distant echo of a memory he couldn't place. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling. Surely it was just nervousness about his financial situation. "Before we talk about the projects we'll be supporting tonight," the woman on stage continued, "I'd like to share a story with you. A story about the transformative power of human dignity and about how a single moment can change two lives forever." She walked slowly across the stage, her eyes scanning the audience. When her gaze met the millionaire's, she paused for an instant, long enough for him to feel an inexplicable chill run down his spine. "7 years ago," she said, her voice gaining an emotional intensity that made the room even quieter, "a 10-year-old girl was starving on the streets of this very city. She was just a child, scared and alone, reaching out her hand, asking for help from anyone who passed by." The millionaire's heart began to beat faster. Something about this story was awakening a buried memory, a moment he had completely forgotten, among so many other acts of casual disdain. "On a cold morning," the businesswoman continued, "she approached a well-dressed man at the door of an elegant restaurant. She was just a child asking for food, nothing more. But that man didn't just refuse to help her." The millionaire's breath caught in his throat. The images began to come back. A cold morning, an expensive restaurant, a dirty barefoot. "A girl. He publicly humiliated her," the woman said, her voice now laden with a contained emotion that made each word echo like a bell. "He said she was a plague, that she would never be worth anything, that she was born to be nothing and would be nothing forever." The room was in absolute silence. Some guests began to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, feeling the tension growing in the air. But the millionaire was paralyzed, finally recognizing the scene the woman was describing. "That girl ran through the streets crying," she continued, carrying with her the cruel words of that man. For a moment she almost believed them, almost, allowed them to define who she was. She made a dramatic pause, letting the silence linger until it became almost unbearable. "But then," she said, a smile touching her lips, "something extraordinary happened. A kind person found her, took her in, and taught her a fundamental lesson. We are defined not by what others say about us, but by what we choose to do with our lives." The millionaire was as pale as a ghost. His hands trembled slightly as he finally began to understand what was happening. The woman on stage, the familiar voice, the story he knew so well. "Ladies and gentlemen," the businesswoman said, her voice now gaining a power that made everyone present lean forward, "I am that girl." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. People began to turn to look at each other, processing the extraordinary revelation they had just heard. But the businesswoman's eyes were fixed on a single man in the audience, the man who had planted the seeds of her determination without even knowing it. "And the man who humiliated me that morning," she continued, pointing discreetly in his direction, "is here with us tonight." All heads turned, hundreds of eyes fixed on the millionaire, who was now visibly trembling. He wanted to get up and run away, but his legs seemed to have lost all their strength. He was trapped there, exposed before the entire elite of the city. "That child grew up," the businesswoman said, her voice now soft but implacable. "She studied with a determination fueled by humiliation. She worked 16 hours a day, driven by the memory of those cruel words, and she built a business empire with a single goal in mind." She stepped down from the stage and began to walk towards the table where he was sitting. Each step echoed through the silent room like a hammer blow. Not a goal of revenge, she clarified, stopping before him, but a goal of justice, to show that a person's worth is not measured by their bank account, but by the strength of their character. The millionaire finally managed to find his voice, although it came out as a hoarse whisper. I'm the girl you said would never be anything, she replied with a smile that had no malice, only a deep sadness. And today, I need to give you some news that you might find interesting. She signaled to her assistant, who approached carrying a folder of documents. With precise movements, she took out a series of papers and placed them on the table before him. My company has just acquired the majority shares of your business group, she said, with the calmness of someone announcing the weather. As of tomorrow, you are no longer the owner of your own empire. The document was there, black and white, stamped and signed, legal, final, irreversible. In a matter of minutes, he had lost everything, not just his fortune, but his identity, his status, his reason for existing. Why? He managed to murmur, the words almost lost in his tight throat. The businesswoman leaned in slightly, speaking, low enough that only he could hear. To teach the same lesson you taught me that morning, that real power is not in the money we possess, but in the impact we make on people's lives. She straightened up and spoke back to the entire room. Today, I learned that revenge brings no satisfaction, but justice sets us free. The silence that followed the revelation was deafening. Hundreds of people, the city's business and social elite, were witnessing the downfall of one of the most powerful men they knew. The millionaire remained seated, staring blankly at the documents that had just sealed his fate, as if he couldn't fully process what was happening. The businesswoman returned to the stage, leaving him alone with his public humiliation. But unlike the cruelty he had shown years before, there was a dignity in her movements, a class that made the moment even more powerful. I know everyone. Must be wondering what will happen now, she said, regaining control of the situation with naturalness. And the answer is simple. We will continue the business, but with a completely different philosophy. Some guests began to whisper among themselves. Investors quickly calculated the impact of this radical change on the city's business landscape. Others simply watched the human drama unfolding before their eyes. The millionaire finally managed to stand, his wobbly legs supporting a man who seemed to have aged decades in just a few minutes. He tried to maintain some dignity as he walked towards the exit, but each step was watched by eyes that once saw him with reverence and now gazed at him with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. "Wait," called the businesswoman, making him stop in the middle of the room. He turned slowly, expecting perhaps a final blow, a final humiliation to complete his destruction. But what he saw in her eyes was not cruelty. It was something much more disconcerting, compassion. "I didn't come here for revenge," she repeated, her voice now softer, almost maternal. "I came here to show that there is a difference between power and strength, between wealth and worth. You taught me, unknowingly, the most important lesson of my life." She stepped down from the stage again and walked to him, ignoring the murmurs of the audience. "For years I carried your words with me. You were born to be nothing. For a long time I almost believed it. But then I understood that you were a wrong, not about me, but about what really defines a person's value." The once millionaire looked at her through eyes that were filling with tears. For the first time in his adult life, he was experiencing something he had inflicted on so many others, the feeling of being completely vulnerable. "I built my empire," she continued, "not to destroy yours, but to prove a point. And that point is not that I am better than you. It's that all of us, absolutely everyone, has inherent worth, regardless of our financial situation." The words fell on him like rain on dry land. For decades, He had believed that his wealth made him superior, that his financial power was proof of his worth as a human being. Now, stripped of all that, he was being forced to confront who he really was without the external trappings. What's going to happen to me now?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The businesswoman smiled, not with malice, but with a genuine kindness that left him even more disconcerted. "That depends on you," she replied. "You can choose to see this as the end of everything or as the beginning of something new, as an opportunity to discover who you are when you have nothing to hide behind." She gestured to her assistant, who approached with another set of documents. "I'm offering you a job," she said, causing a murmur of surprise throughout the room. "Not an executive position, not a position of power. An honest job, with fair pay, helping to manage the company's social programs." The offer was like a punch to the gut. He, who had commanded empires, being offered a common job, working for the same person he had humiliated years before. It was the perfect irony, the circle closing in a way he could never have imagined. "Why would you do that?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Because," she replied, "every human being deserves a second chance, even those who don't believe in the worth of others." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was witnessing not only the fall of a tyrant, but the demonstration of a greatness of spirit that transcended any desire for revenge. The ex-millionaire looked at the documents in his hands, the employment contract that represented everything he had despised throughout his life. A common job, a modest salary, the need to work to live instead of living off the work of others. But there was something else in those papers, an opportunity for redemption, a chance to discover if there was still any humanity behind decades of arrogance and cruelty. I need to think," he said finally. "Of course," she replied, with understanding. "But remember one thing. A person's worth is not in what they possess, but in what they choose to do with the opportunities they receive." As he left the room, carrying the weight of his new reality, the businesswoman returned to the stage to continue the event. But now, everyone present knew they were in the presence of someone truly special. Not for her wealth or power, but for her ability to transform pain into wisdom, humiliation into dignity. 3 weeks had passed since the night that changed everything. The ex-millionaire had become an almost ghostly figure in the city, appearing occasionally in public places, but avoiding any social contact. His mansion had been put up for sale, his luxury cars auctioned off to pay debts, and he now lived in a modest apartment downtown, something he had never imagined possible. On that particular morning, he was sitting in a simple diner, not unlike those he had frequented in his youth, before building his empire. The coffee cost a fraction of what he used to pay for his morning drink, but surprisingly, it had a flavor he had forgotten existed. The taste of something real without the artifice of excessive luxury. On his table, the documents of the employment contract offered by the businesswoman remained untouched. For weeks, he had struggled with himself, alternating between indignation and something he had only recently managed to identify as curiosity. Would it be possible to rebuild a life without the pillars he had always considered essential? He watched the people passing by on the street, workers on their way to their jobs, students carrying books, mothers pushing strollers. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel superior to them. In fact, he began to wonder if he ever really had been. It was then that a familiar scene caught his attention. Across the street, a child of about 8 years old was timidly approaching passers-by, extending a small hand seeking help. Most people hurried past, completely ignoring his presence. The ex-millionaire felt something strange churning in his stomach. It was like looking through a window into the past, seeing his own cruelty reflected in the behavior of others. He stood up without thinking and crossed the street. "Hi," he said gently to the boy, crouching down to be at eye level. "What's your name?" The child looked at him suspiciously, the same expression he vaguely remembered seeing on the girl's face years ago. "Michael," he replied quietly. "Michael, are you hungry?" he asked, and when the boy nodded timidly, he continued, "How about we get some breakfast together? I know a place around here that serves some really good pancakes." It was surreal. The man who had publicly humiliated a child was now inviting another to a meal. But it wasn't a pose or a calculated gesture. It was something genuine, born from a new understanding of what really mattered. During breakfast, Michael told his story. He had lost his parents in an accident, lived with an aunt who worked 16 hours a day to support 4 children, and sometimes needed to ask for money on the street to supplement the family income. It wasn't laziness or bad character. It was pure need for survival. "Do you go to school?" asked the ex-millionaire. "When I can," replied Michael, "but sometimes I need to work to help at home." The words hit the man like daggers. How many times had he judged children like Michael, assuming they were lazy or ill-mannered, without ever bothering to understand their real circumstances? After ensuring that Michael had a full meal and some money to take home, the ex-millionaire returned to his apartment with a mental clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He picked up the documents of the employment contract and, for the first time, read them completely. It wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to be part of something bigger than himself. The company of the woman who had been a girl maintained extensive social programs, scholarships, support centers for needy families, professional training programs. It was exactly the kind of initiative he had always scorned as bleeding resources. Now he understood that it was investment in human dignity. That afternoon he called the number that was on the contract. The secretary answered politely and scheduled a meeting for the next day. When he hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. The next morning, wearing one of his last remaining suits, now without the luxury accessories he had once considered essential, he headed to the company building. The same building he had observed with envy and resentment weeks before, now welcomed him as a possibility for a fresh start. The businesswoman received him in her office with the same dignity she had demonstrated on the night of the event. There was no malice in her eyes, no satisfaction for revenge consummated. There was something much more powerful: hope that people can change. "Have you decided to accept the offer?" she asked directly. "Yes," he replied, and for the first time in years, his voice sounded completely honest. "But I need to ask you something. Why are you doing this? Why give me a second chance after everything I did?" She smiled, the same smile that had illuminated the face of the frightened girl years ago, but now matured by wisdom and strengthened by experience. "Because," she said simply, "every human being deserves the opportunity to discover their true worth, even those who need to lose everything to find themselves." He nodded, finally understanding the depth of those words. His journey back to humanity was just beginning, but for the first time since childhood, he felt he was on the right path. 6 months had passed since the ex-millionaire began his work at the company of the woman who had once been a scorned girl. In that time, he had experienced a transformation more profound than any change that money had ever provided. He now worked as a coordinator of one of the company's social programs, visiting needy communities and helping to identify children who needed support. It was a Tuesday morning when he found himself again in the same neighborhood where everything had started years ago. But now he wasn't there as an arrogant tycoon in his luxury car. He was there as someone who had learned the true meaning of serving. He walked the streets accompanied by a team of social workers, visiting families enrolled in the Educational Assistance Program. In each house, he saw reflections of his own journey, people struggling against difficult circumstances, maintaining their dignity even when the world seemed to conspire against them. "This is the next family on the list," said one of the social workers, stopping before a simple but well-kept house. "They are responsible for 3 children, 2 nieces and a nephew who were orphaned." When the door opened, the ex-millionaire found himself face to face with a middle-aged woman who made him stop in the middle of the introduction. It was the same woman who had found the girl crying in the alley years ago, Mrs. Davison, the NGO worker who had changed that child's destiny. "Mrs. Davison?" he said, genuinely surprised. She looked at him strangely for a moment, then her face lit up with recognition. Aren't you that man who—" "Yes," he interrupted softly. "It's me, but I'm not the same person anymore." The encounter could have been awkward, but Mrs. Davison possessed the wisdom of someone who had dedicated her life to believing in the human capacity for change. She invited him in, and during the next hour, he heard the story of the family she now cared for alone. "After the parents died," she explained, "the children came to live with me. I don't have much, but we have love. And sometimes that's what matters most." One of the children, Michael, the same boy he had met asking for money on the street months ago, recognized him immediately. He ran to him with a smile that lit up the entire room. "It's the man who took me for breakfast," exclaimed the boy. "Mrs. Davison, he was really nice to me." The ex-millionaire felt a lump in his throat. Seeing Michael there, clean and well cared for, attending school regularly thanks to the social programs he was now helping to manage, was like witnessing a tangible miracle. "Michael is doing very well in school," said Mrs. Davison with pride. "He said he wants to be an engineer. He wants to build beautiful houses for people who need them." The words echoed in the ex-millionaire's mind. How many houses had he built throughout his career? Hundreds, maybe thousands. But all had been designed for those who could pay high prices, symbols of status and exclusivity. He had never thought of building for those who really needed it. "Michael," he said, kneeling down to be at the boy's height, "you know that there is a program in our company that can help you realize that dream?" The boy's eyes widened. "Really?" "Very serious. And I promise that I will personally ensure that you have every opportunity to study and become the best engineer this city has ever seen." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. The man who had spent decades accumulating wealth for himself made a promise that was worth more than any fortune he had ever possessed. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly rich. When they left Mrs. Davison's house, the ex-millionaire was visibly emotional. One of his co-workers, noticing his state, asked if he was all right. "I'm more than all right," he replied, looking back one last time. "I'm discovering who I really am." That afternoon, he requested a meeting with his employer, the woman who had transformed humiliation into an opportunity for growth. When he sat before her, there was a determination in his eyes that she recognized immediately. "I want to do more," he said without preamble. "I want to use everything I've learned in decades of business to expand the social programs. I want to build houses for families like Mrs. Davison's. I want to create real opportunities for children like Michael." She observed him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant man who had humiliated a girl, but someone who had genuinely found a new purpose in life. "That means you'll have to work longer hours, earn less money, and deal with problems that don't have easy solutions," she warned. "It means," he replied with a smile that finally reached his eyes, "that for the first time in my life, my work will have real meaning." She extended her hand, sealing not only a professional agreement, but the recognition of a complete transformation. The man who had left that ballroom months ago as a defeated man had returned as someone who had finally understood the true meaning of victory. Outside, the sun set over the city, painting the sky with golden hues that seemed to symbolize a new beginning. And for the first time in decades, two destinies that had crossed in pain now united in a common purpose. 2 years had passed since the night that redefined two existences forever. The city had transformed in ways that few could have predicted, and at the center of this transformation were two people whose destinies intertwined in an extraordinary way. The housing program created by the partnership between the businesswoman and her most unlikely collaborator had become a national benchmark. Hundreds of families now lived in decent homes, built not only with bricks and cement, but with love and purpose. Michael, the boy who dreamed of being an engineer, now attended one of the best technical schools in the city with a full scholarship, his future shining with infinite possibilities. On that special morning, the ex-millionaire, who everyone now knew simply as Carlos, his real name that had been obscured by decades of corporate titles, was reviewing the plans for the new vocational education center that would be inaugurated. At the end of the month, his desk, once filled with financial reports focused only on profit, was now covered with projects that measured success in transformed lives. Mrs. Davison had become one of the main collaborators of the project. Her practical experience perfectly complementing the business knowledge that Carlos brought to the team. Together, they had created a unique methodology for identifying and supporting children at risk, a model that was being replicated in other cities. "Carlos," said the familiar voice behind him. It was her, the woman who had been a girl now, recognized nationally as one of the most influential business people in the country, but who, for him, had become much more than that. She had become the teacher who taught him the true meaning of leadership. "The numbers from the last quarter have arrived," she continued, placing a folder on his desk, "and I have something to show you." Carlos opened the documents and his eyes widened. It wasn't just the company's financial numbers, which remained excellent, but data on the social impact of their programs. More than 1,000 children had been directly benefited, 300 families were now in decent housing, and the school enrollment rate in the communities served had increased by 70%. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, feeling an emotion that money had never provided. "It's the result of when we use resources to empower people instead of just accumulating wealth," she replied with a smile. "And I want to propose something." She sat before him, assuming the posture that Carlos had learned to recognize. She was about to present an idea that would change everything again. "I want you to take over as president of the company's social division," she said directly, "with complete autonomy to expand the programs and create new projects." The proposal left Carlos momentarily speechless. He who had lost an empire built on exploitation was now receiving the opportunity to lead another kind of empire, one built on hope and human dignity. "Why me?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You could choose anyone more qualified, with specific training in social work." "Because," she replied, "you understand better than anyone the difference between having power and being powerful. You have lived on both sides of that reality, and that gives you a unique perspective." Carlos looked out the window of his office, no longer a luxurious penthouse with panoramic views, but a simple room overlooking the community where they worked. He could see children playing in the small square they had built, families walking, the safe streets of the new residential neighborhood, young people heading to the vocational training center. "I accept," he said finally, "but with one condition." She raised an eyebrow, curious. "I want Mrs. Davison to be my vice president." And I want Michael, when he graduates, to be guaranteed the first job as a junior engineer in our housing projects." The smile that lit up her face was the answer he needed. That afternoon, during the team meeting where they announced the changes, Carlos stood up to give a speech. He looked at each person in the room, social workers, architects, educators, psychologists, all united by a common purpose that transcended any individual interest. "A few years ago," he began, "I believed that success was measured by the number of zeros in a bank account. I thought my wealth made me superior to others, especially those who had nothing." He paused, looking specifically at the woman who had transformed his understanding of everything. "I was completely wrong. The true value of a life is not in what we accumulate, but in what we offer. It's not in what we possess, but in what we share. And it's definitely not in the power we exercise over others, but in the love we awaken in them." His voice gained strength as he continued, laden with a conviction that came from lived experience, not from abstract theory. "Each child we help to study is worth more than any financial investment. Each family that earns a decent home represents a return that cannot be measured in percentages. Each young person we discover, empowered to pursue their dreams, is a dividend that multiplies for generations." When he finished, the silence in the room was broken by heartfelt applause. But what touched Carlos most was seeing tears in the eyes of Mrs. Davison, who had become not only his colleague but the mother he never had, someone who taught him that unconditional love exists and can transform any heart. At the end of the day, when everyone had left, Carlos and the businesswoman remained in the room, watching the sunset paint the city with golden hues. It was a moment of silent reflection on the extraordinary journey they had shared. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that man in the restaurant had been kind to me that morning." Carlos turned to look at her, intrigued by the reflection. "I probably would have been grateful for a few minutes and then forgotten," she continued with a thoughtful smile. "Maybe I would never have developed the determination necessary to get where I am today. Maybe I would never have understood the depth of the pain that injustice can cause." "So, you're saying I'm responsible for your success?" asked Carlos with an ironic smile. "I'm saying," she replied, "that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst curses. That pain, when transformed into purpose, can move mountains, and that we never know how our acts, good or bad, can echo through time." She stood up and walked to the window, contemplating the view of the community they had helped to build. "But there's something more important I learned on this journey," she said, turning to face him. "Forgiveness isn't something we do for the other person. It's something we do for ourselves. And redemption isn't a destination. It's a path we choose to walk every day." Carlos nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He had spent months hating himself for his past actions, carrying the weight of guilt as a penance. But he had gradually learned that true reparation was not in self-punishment, but in the active transformation of the world around him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for teaching me that it's possible to start over, for showing me that the real worth of a person is in their ability to grow, to change, to become better." "And thank you," she replied, "for proving that no one is lost beyond the possibility of redemption, for demonstrating that even the most hardened hearts can learn to love." At that moment, both understood that they had become something more than reconciled ex-enemies. They had become living examples that humanity is capable of transforming its worst experiences into its greatest victories. As they left the office together, heading to their respective homes, she to her elegant but welcoming penthouse, he to his simple but meaningful apartment, they knew that their lives had found a purpose that transcended any individual success. The following week, during the inauguration of the new educational center, Michael cut the ribbon wearing a yellow engineer's helmet that Carlos had given him. The symbol was perfect. A child who had started life begging was now opening the doors to a future built on hope and opportunity. Mrs. Davison, now with the official title of Vice President of Social Development, gave the opening speech. Her words, simple but powerful, echoed throughout the community. This building is not made only of bricks and cement. It's made of dreams that refuse to die, of second chances that turned into first opportunities, and of two people who proved that love always conquers hate. Carlos and the businesswoman stood side by side on the stage, not as ex-enemies, but as partners in a mission that would last the rest of their lives. They had learned that true power is not in dominating others, but in elevating them. That true wealth is not in what we accumulate, but in what we distribute. And that true success is not in what we achieve for ourselves, but in what we build for the next generations. When the applause ceased and people began to explore the new facilities, classrooms equipped with state-of-the-art technology, workshops for technical training, a library with thousands of books, community spaces designed to strengthen bonds, Carlos found himself thinking about the cold morning of years ago. If he could go back in time, would he be kind to that frightened girl? Probably yes, but now he understood that the past could not be changed. Only its consequences could be transformed. And so, as the sun set over the city, two lives that had crossed in pain now united in hope, proving that there is no humiliation so deep that it cannot be transformed into dignity, nor heart so hardened that it cannot learn to love. The girl who had been scorned had grown to become a woman who changed an entire city. The man who had scorned had learned that true worth is not in what we possess, but in who we choose to be. And together, they would continue building a world where no child would ever feel worthless, where no dream would be too small to be nurtured, and where every human being would be reminded of their inherent dignity. Because in the end, we are all just people trying to find our place in the world, and sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what really matters. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive new stories every day. Because each of us has the power to transform pain into purpose, humiliation into dignity, and it's always worth believing in the infinite potential of the human heart.